Welcome to the Best Practices in Budget Development training for fiscal year 2023 AmeriCorps State and National Native Nations Grant applicants and Native Nations Planning Grant applicants. I appreciate you taking the time to consider the best ways to develop a compliant and competitive AmeriCorps budget. During this recording, I will share several sample budget narrative entries. A full sample budget is posted on the fiscal year 2023 AmeriCorps State and National Native Nations funding page for your reference. As a follow-up to this training, AmeriCorps' Office of Grant Administration will host 2 live budget development office hour webinars on Wednesday, March 8th and Wednesday, March 29th. Both webinars begin at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration details for these question and answer sessions are available on the competition funding page and at the end of this training. Please be aware that during the office hours, AmeriCorps staff will not respond to questions about the specific content of your proposed budget. Rather, we will provide clarifications to help applicants submit a compliant budget. I encourage you to note any questions that come to mind as you review this training, and if they are not addressed by the end of the recording, bring them to one or both of the office hour webinars. Before I get started, I want to note that most of the content will focus on the budgets submitted as part of a cost reimbursement application, which includes some operational grant applications and all planning grant applications. Although fixed award recipients are not subject to the same budget and cost principles requirements as cost reimbursement award recipients, this training will help all applicants, both cost reimbursement and fixed award applicants, improve their fiscal management responsibilities. So even if you are planning to submit a fixed award application, you may find the information helpful. As a reminder, new applicants may not apply for full cost fixed amount awards. They may, however, apply for Education Award Program funding, also referenced as EAP awards, or Professional Corps programs. Please consult the notice and mandatory supplemental information for details on these application types. Additionally, this content will address both Native Nations operational grant budgets and Native Nations planning grant budgets, as most of the budget details are the same for both application types. Where there are differences, such as the unallowability of AmeriCorps member support costs in planning grant budgets, I will note it in this recording. My goal for today's session is to help you, the AmeriCorps Native Nations Grant applicant, acquire the knowledge and skills needed to understand the function of and develop an effective AmeriCorps budget and budget narrative. Your submission of a complete and high-quality budget will help demonstrate that you have the fiscal capacity to manage an AmeriCorps program. During this session, I will holistically review the components of an AmeriCorps budget, which includes both AmeriCorps resources and the applicant's matching resources. At the end of this webinar, you should understand how to determine if costs are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable as determined by 2 CFR 200, the Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, frequently referred to as the Uniform Guidance. Using this information and the tips and best practices shared here, you should be prepared to submit a compliant and competitive budget. Because the budget and budget narrative becomes part of the grant recipient's contract with AmeriCorps, AmeriCorps wants and expects applicants to present a strong and accurate document. The approved budget will not only serve as a financial guide for grant-supported activities, but it helps to ensure compliance with the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping AmeriCorps monitor grant and financial compliance, it can serve as a tool for both AmeriCorps and award recipients to measure progress toward any match requirements, and for grantees to monitor budgeted expenses to actual expenses, a key part of the funds management process. Before I dive into the details of budget development, I want to point out that budget development is just one component of an effective budget and funds management process. Let's take a quick look at the full process. As you started to work on your AmeriCorps application, you may have asked yourself, how do I design a strong budget? Whether you actually started the process with that question or not, as part of the pre-award project development process, it's likely that your team already determined the needs you wanted to address with AmeriCorps resources, set up program or project goals and objectives, and decided on a strategy to accomplish those goals. To develop the budget, applicants must then translate the strategy into dollars and prepare a budget that is aligned with the stated program goals and objectives. Post-award, grantees will continue to manage their budgets effectively by establishing a budget control process, monitoring expenses, that is, regularly comparing your budgeted to actual expenses to check for over and under spending, and modifying the budget as necessary with approval from AmeriCorps when required. Your budget control process and ongoing monitoring of expenses are key components of funds management. And I highlight the importance of funds management now during the application process so that it's something you are aware of and can plan for should AmeriCorps grant your award. Funds management is very important to AmeriCorps and to the entire federal government. And we're introducing some new grantee trainings related to funds management over the coming months to support you if we approve your application. Applicants will find those trainings on the Manage Your Grant page of the AmeriCorps.gov website. For now, let's go back to the budget preparation process, which is the focus of today's training. Let's talk about an approved budget. It should be realistic. That is, it should reflect expected program revenues and expenses and its capacity to carry out program activities. It should also be consistent and aligned with the program's goals and objectives as described in the program narrative. And it should be flexible. A project's financial and operating circumstances often change, and the budget must adapt to those changing circumstances. For now, we will focus on the realistic and consistent features as they relate specifically to budget design. Now, a few minutes ago, I outlined the steps that your team may have taken as part of the budget development process. AmeriCorps encourages applicants to approach budget design as a team activity, engaging various departments and individuals based on their expertise. Let's consider the various departments or individuals in your organization that you could engage on your budget design team and the specific expertise they bring to the process. For example, your human resources unit should have the cost of things like salary and fringe benefits and criminal history check costs. The program office should know the costs for training members and for delivering services to the community. Your accounting office will have the historical spending rates for specific costs. Your grants office should be able to review your application for compliance, and other staff may have additional expertise and can review the budget for clarity. Now, I certainly realize if you are part of a small organization, you may not have all these resources available to you, but that doesn't mean you should undertake budget development in a vacuum without input from others. Don't be afraid to involve as many others as is required, including your organization's leaders, to present the most realistic data in the budget and make sure that the document aligns with your programmatic goals and objectives. AmeriCorps recommends that applicants use historical information when it is possible, and as a reminder, your accounting department should have that information. Then all you need to do is adjust it as necessary so that the data is timelier, and include that information as appropriate as part of your budget narrative description. Your strong budget design provides a framework for effective budget management, and it ensures a realistic scope, appropriate detail, a competitive proposal, compliance, and effective delivery. That is, it serves as a guide for program implementation. In order to create a budget that is strong, accurate, and requires minimal resolution, I encourage you to take your time and engage others in data collection and quality review. As I previously noted, one of the objectives for this session is to provide you with tips and tools for creating a competitive budget narrative. The first tip is to read and follow the instructions in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the notice, and in the application instructions, which include minimum and maximum cost levels and required line items, both of which we will discuss later in this presentation. Within the application instructions, applicants will find detailed budget instructions for cost reimbursement grants in attachments B and C, and fixed amount grant applicants will find detailed budget instructions in attachments D and E. The strongest and most compliant budget narratives adhere to the guidelines in these documents, and that saves all of us time and effort later. I do want to note that the application instructions are applicable to various grant competitions, so please make sure that you are also reviewing the notice for details on this specific competition. I also encourage you to become familiar with the uniform guidance and only include those costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. You will find this resource online at ecfr.federalregister.gov under Title II, Grants and Agreements. After you and your team estimate the financial resources you need to achieve the stated program goals, you will then organize them into the narrative's budget categories, again following the guidance in the notice and the application instructions. As you develop the narrative, remember to provide adequate descriptions and clear calculations. eGrants will automatically populate a budget summary and a budget narrative report that should be able to serve as standalone documents without a need to reference the application narrative for explanation. And for this reason, I always recommend having someone outside of your full budget development team review the document to check for any holes or inaccuracies. The uniform guidance, as well as the notice and application instructions, specify any costs that are considered unallowable, such as lobbying, entertainment, alcoholic beverages, and fundraising. AmeriCorps strongly encourages applicants to review the uniform guidance to avoid including unallowable costs in your proposed budget. Other unallowable costs include those that are not necessary to meet the program objectives. For example, budgeting AmeriCorps symposium travel expenses for 6 staff when only 4 staff are included in the AmeriCorps budget is not allowable, and it could be considered waste, fraud, or abuse. Another example is budgeting $5,000 for landscaping equipment and materials for a literacy program. These are costs that would be considered unreasonable from a prudent person perspective, or they just have no logical basis for inclusion in the budget. It is important to remember that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or your required match. As shown on the visual, the grantee share of total costs increases over time. First-time successful applicants are required to match at 24% for the first 3-year funding period. Beginning in year 4, the match requirement gradually increases each year to 50%, or a minimum dollar-for-dollar match by year 10. As noted on this slide, there is no match requirement for fixed amount grants. AmeriCorps does not provide all the funds necessary to operate the program. Applicant organizations should prepare to secure the additional revenue required to operate the program and enter the sources of these matching funds in the Source of Funds section of the budget. If you are applying for any type of fixed amount award, please make sure to complete this section to show how you are covering the program costs beyond those provided by AmeriCorps. And I will review the Source of Funds section later in this training. Cash and in-kind contributions are acceptable match when they are necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of project or program objectives, when they are allowable under the uniform guidance and application instructions, when they are included in the approved budget and allowable under program guidelines, and when they are not paid for by the federal government under another award except when authorized by federal statute, when they are compliant with the terms and conditions of the award and the uniform guidance, and when they are verifiable from the organization's records. The matching resources must be treated the same as the AmeriCorps share, and consistent treatment includes complete and accurate documentation. A frequently heard phrase in the world of grants management is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So please make sure to document all of your expenses. Now let me go back to that point about matching resources being allowable when they are not paid for by the federal government under another award, except when authorized by federal statute. AmeriCorps legislation permits the use of non-AmeriCorps federal funds for the grantee share of the AmeriCorps budget. Additionally, Public Law 93-638 allows tribes to use federal funds to meet cash or in-kind requirements for grants from another federal agency. When using other federal funds as match, you must report the use of those other federal funds on your federal financial reports to AmeriCorps and at closeout. Also keep in mind that you may not use other AmeriCorps resources, such as VISTA or AmeriCorps Seniors resources, as match for an AmeriCorps state and national award. Because applicants must demonstrate an adequate plan for non-AmeriCorps support, they are required to include a source of matching resources in the budget narrative, entering a description of the source along with the amount, a cash or in-kind classification, the type of the matching resource, that is, whether it's coming from a state or local government, whether it's federal funds or whether it's private donations, and then a confirmation of whether the sources of match are secured or proposed. Applicants do not need to secure 100% of the match prior to submitting the application, but anticipated match must be included, and the total in this section must equal the amount of match shown in the budget. Also, please note that the eGrants budget report rounds the budgeted match amount up to the nearest percentage. For example, a budget with a 49.76% match will appear to match at 50%, even though it is not a dollar-for-dollar match. So I always recommend that applicants calculate the percentage of match either outside of eGrants or review the budget narrative report to ensure that you are either meeting or exceeding the required percentage. Please remember that although there is no match required of fixed amount grant applicants who are applying for a fixed amount grant must complete that source of matching funds section, the same as operational grant applicants, and the total of that section must equal the budgeted match exactly. While AmeriCorps hopes that applicants will take every effort to show how they will support the program beyond the AmeriCorps resources, there are options available for match relief. Applicants may qualify for an alternative match schedule that increases match over time to a maximum of 35% rather than 50%. Applicants may also request an individual match waiver, and details for requesting either of these options are on the Manage Your Grant page of the AmeriCorps.gov website. Additionally, applicants may request cash match replacement funds. If requesting these funds, you will include the amount of requested cash match replacement in the source of funds section of the budget narrative, and we will review an example of that later in this training. As you enter data into your budget narrative, you will notice that it includes both the AmeriCorps and grantee share of project costs. Additionally, the budget classifies cost into direct and indirect or administrative cost categories. Direct costs include program operating costs and member costs, which the budget breaks into major categories that may include specific line items such as those on the slide. These costs are allocable to the grant, that is, they are associated with grant-related activities. General or centralized organizational expenses that are spread across the entire organization are indirect or administrative costs. As you, the AmeriCorps applicant, develop your budget management systems and specifically the budget control and funds management processes, you will want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking and documenting these expenses if you do not already have them. I will now review the specific budget categories and the related guidance in the AmeriCorps application instructions, beginning with Section 1, the Program Operating Costs. Both operational and planning grant applicants will complete this section. However, any member-related costs are not allowable on the planning grant budgets. In Section A, Personnel Expenses, applicants will individually list each staff position supported by the grant and provide the annual salary and level of effort as a percentage of the full-time equivalent, or FTE, devoted to the award. Please remember to only include positions that are supported by the application narrative, and make sure not to include the value of direct community service provided by volunteers unless it is for organizational functions such as accounting or auditing or training. In addition, if you have other AmeriCorps grants, it's always a good idea to confirm that you are not over budgeting, that is, including more than 100% of staff time on your budgets. Applicants can do this by including a statement in each line or at the end of the section that states something like, the percentage of time allocated to budgeted staff does not exceed 100% across all AmeriCorps grants. Additionally, applicants should confirm that the salary information provided is consistent across the multiple grants. While it may be appropriate to budget the executive director's salary as $65,000 on one application and $75,000 on the application you submit 6 months later, you could add an explanation that the higher salary reflects a cost of living and performance-related salary increase, just to provide some additional clarification. In Section B, Personnel Fringe Benefits, applicants will identify the type of fringe benefit, for example, FICA, health and life insurance, workers' compensation, state unemployment, retirement costs, and include the cost for each staff. Please note that the fringe benefit cost should align with the salary lines. That is, this section should only include staff included in the personnel expenses section. If the benefit amount is more than 30% of salary costs, applicants must list the covered benefits separately and justify the costs. Now, that doesn't mean that applicants need to break out each expense into its own line item. You could state something like health insurance at 24%, retirement at 10%, and FICA at 7.65%, rather than noting that fringe benefits are 41.65% of the related salary costs. I do want to note that Applicants do not need to create individual line items for each benefit that connects to a personnel expenses line items. In other words, if you have 8 staff budgeted in Section 1A, you don't need 8 health insurance lines and 8 FICA lines and 8 life insurance lines and so on. If the benefit calculation is consistent for all staff, applicants can enter the cost as a percentage of all staff salaries, such as fringe calculated at 21% of personnel expenses. Alternatively, applicants can enter the type of fringe, such as health insurance or retirement, on each line as a percentage of all personnel expenses, such as health insurance, 28% of each salary, retirement, 14% of each salary, etc. It's only when the benefits vary for each budgeted staff that applicants must break those line items out accordingly. And you will find an example of this in the sample budget narrative that is attached to this training. In Section C, Travel, applicants will include the purpose and the costs and the type of travel, such as airfare, ground transportation, lodging, per diem, as well as the number of trips and the number of staff or members traveling, and make sure that your calculation is clear and it is simple to follow. Do note that applicants may budget mileage at a rate higher than the federal reimbursement rate, which is 65.5 cents per mile as of January 1st, 2023, if that follows the organization's policy. And if it does, please make a note of that in your budget narrative. Please also be aware that attendance at the AmeriCorps sponsored technical assistance meetings, including the annual symposium, is an expectation of all direct grantees, and travel funds should be budgeted for new grantees and new staff of existing grantees to attend the AmeriCorps symposium, including any pre-conference events. Take care to ensure that training costs are not included in this travel section, and likewise that travel costs are not included in your training line items. And for operational grant applicants, please make sure you are separating your staff and member travel costs. Section D is where equipment expenses will be budgeted. And those equipment expenses are defined as tangible, non-expendable, personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. If it's less than that, the expense goes into the supply section. Equipment costs are limited to 10% of the total AmeriCorps funds requested. And when budgeting for equipment, applicants must show the unit cost and the number of units, as well as provide a justification for the equipment in the budget narrative. Section E, the supply section, includes those costs that are identified as consumable supplies and materials. And when including supplies in your budget, please make sure to individually list any single item costing $1,000 or more. Cost reimbursement operational applicants must also budget for member service gear. AmeriCorps identity items, preferably clothing with an AmeriCorps logo, is a required budget expense and may be charged to the AmeriCorps share only if it includes the AmeriCorps logo. Applicants should make a note in the budget narrative when items include the AmeriCorps logo. Operational applicants may charge safety gear to the AmeriCorps share, regardless of whether or not it has a logo. Organizations must purchase any non-logoed member service gear with non-AmeriCorps funds. In Section F, Contractual and Consultant Services, applicants will include all contractual and consultant services except for training and evaluation consultants. While AmeriCorps does not impose a maximum daily rate, we do ask that applicants include the basis on which they determine the expense, and that could actually be a daily rate. Again, I remind you not to include the value of direct community service performed by volunteers here or in the personnel expenses section unless it is for organizational functions such as accounting, auditing, or equipment maintenance. Section G, training, includes expenses related to staff training and for operational grant applicants only for member training. Staff training costs will enhance staff skills for effective project implementation, and member training costs, when allowed, support members as they carry out their service activities, and that could include life after AmeriCorps training. Be sure, once again, to include a daily rate for consultants if you're using one, and if not, to enter some type of detail that justifies the cost. I want to speak briefly to the inclusion of food costs in the training section, as this is often a topic of concern. Please be aware that food provided during the dissemination of information, such as during a training event, is allowable. Additionally, if breaking for participants to go off-site for food would be time-consuming due to logistics, food could be allowable. So when proposing the inclusion of food in the training section, applicants should always make sure to note situations like these in that budget narrative justification. Section 8, evaluation, includes project evaluation costs, including additional staff, consultant, and evaluation instruments. This is not for assessing progress toward performance measures, but it is actually an evaluation of the impact on the community or an assessment of the overall program design and systems. Once again, if you're using consultants here and they're being paid on a daily rate, please make sure to include that rate. And finally, we come to Section I, Other Program Costs, which tends to be a little bit of a catch-all category for those projected expenses that just don't neatly fit into the other categories. In this section, applicants must include national service criminal history checks for employees, members, and others who receive a salary, education award, living allowance, or stipend. And if it's not included, please explain how these costs are covered or that the checks were already completed. Here you may also include cost of office space, utilities, phone, internet, or similar expenses for members and project staff, providing that the expenses are not included as part of an organization's approved indirect cost rate and that they are prorated and appropriately allocated to the project. Operational grant applicants may include member recognition costs, which are allowable if appropriately justified and if they exclude gifts and food provided in an entertainment setting. And finally, multi-state applicants may include subgrants here. And when budgeting for subgrants, you will indicate the approximate number of subgrants and the average amount of the award. And if there's any subgrantee match required, you will enter that in the grantee share column of the budget. So let's review some budget narrative sample entries that include a few errors so you can avoid those errors in your own budget. This staff travel section includes several errors. First, we see that the applicant included the AmeriCorps sponsored grantee training, but they neglected to include a cost calculation to explain how they determined the $2,930. And while this is required in a budget, the cost may not meet the prudent person standard. For example, let's say the travelers were based in Northern Virginia, and we see here on this sample that the training is a Washington, D.C. based training. So it's probably not reasonable to expect that the travel costs would be nearly $3,000. In the second line item, the applicant proposed a mileage rate that is higher than the current federal rate. Now, this is allowable, as I previously mentioned, providing that it aligns with the organization's policy. This applicant could avoid having to clarify that rate by making a budget narrative notation that this follows the organization's travel policy. An example of that is included in the last line of this sample section. The third line item shows that the applicant did not double check the calculations for accuracy. The details in the description total $2,034 rather than the budgeted $1,954. And this often results when applicants revise the budget sections. And that's why we can't remind you to go back and double check your work over and over. The last line in this section includes costs for member travel. And while member travel is an allowable cost for operational applicants, and this is an appropriately detailed entry, there is a specific member travel section. And it's important to check that you are entering your line items in the appropriate section. The example here at the bottom of the page shows a correct and comprehensive entry. There's adequate detail included for each line item, including the number of individuals traveling, the number of travel days or miles traveled, and the mileage rate, and all calculations total the budgeted amount, and no erroneous costs are included in this section. Here's a sample from the supplies section of a budget narrative that includes proposed costs that might require some additional information or edits. In the first line, the applicant provided an average monthly cost of the office supplies, but the calculation is incorrect. It appears to be based on only 10 months of cost. The computer line item is budgeted as $2,200 and it includes no detail. So we don't know how many computers they're proposing to buy and if the line is for just computers or if there are other items included. Without this level of detail, we can't determine if the cost is reasonable and necessary. Also remember that the application instructions state that applicants must specifically list all single supply items with a cost of more than $1,000 per unit. The member supply section includes a cost per member and the number of members, which is great. However, when you calculate it, it totals a bit higher than what is budgeted. It totals $7,030. Because AmeriCorps budget reviews include an assessment of calculation accuracy, I recommend adding terms such as average or approximate or estimated to the description. And it's similar to what you see here in the office supply line or the member travel line in the previous example. And that just allows a little flexibility in the calculation. As I review this sample, I also notice that it doesn't include the AmeriCorps member service gear. This second version includes the member service gear with the appropriate detail, and the additional revisions include the corrected office supply calculation, details about the computers, and the term average in the member supply line. This is a much better and more compliant budget narrative section. Let's move on to section 2, which focuses on member costs, specifically member living allowances and support costs. Again, this section is only applicable to applicants applying for an operational grant. Planning grant applicants will not include any member-related costs in their budgets. The notice stipulates the minimum and maximum living allowances, and this year's full-time living allowance ranges between $17,600 and $35,200 per member. The budget narrative must identify the number of members in each category and the living allowance amount they will receive. There is no minimum living allowance amount for member types other than full-time. However, applicants must not exceed the maximum living allowance for other member types, and the maximum is detailed in the notice. The member support costs must follow the laws of the states where the members serve. FICA, unless exempted by the IRS, is calculated as 7.65% of total living allowances. And do note that applicants who have an IRS exemption must make note of that in the budget narrative. Applicants must offer health care to all full-time members. Programs may not pay health care benefits to less than full-time members with grant funds, whether those funds are coming from the AmeriCorps or the grantee share of the budget, unless those less than full-time members are serving in a full-time capacity for a sustained period of time, such as in a full-time summer program. And in that case, applicants should note that in the budget narrative. Please include the number of members receiving the benefit and a per person cost in the cost calculation. And if you're calculating costs based on the percentage of members that historically accept or that you anticipate will accept this benefit, do make note of that in your justification as well. Please be aware that if you are covering healthcare costs with Indian Health Services resources, you may not include the cost of that coverage on this AmeriCorps budget. Applicants may include workers' compensation costs if the state where the members are serving requires it. If it is not required, then programs must obtain occupational, accidental, death, and dismemberment coverage for members. Be aware that it is the applicant's responsibility to check with the State Department of Labor to determine if you are required to pay workers' compensation, and if so, at what level. And unemployment insurance or other member support costs must also include the same type of calculation details as I outlined in these other sections. Applicants may not charge the cost of unemployment insurance taxes to the grant unless it is mandated by state law. Let's now consider a sample member support cost section that includes some errors. This applicant included the required FICA for members, but calculated it on an incorrect base. According to the application instructions, applicants must calculate FICA at 7.65% of total living allowances. In the healthcare line item, the applicant is proposing to cover member healthcare costs with benefits from Indian Health Services. As I previously noted, that is allowable. You may recall that I also said you cannot include those costs as part of your match in the way that this applicant did. Instead, it should be added to show that the applicant is providing the required healthcare coverage, but you should add it as a $0 line item. What about any missing line items? Do we see that workers' compensation that the application instructions state as a required line item if the state requires workers' compensation coverage for members? If the state does not, AmeriCorps requires grantees to obtain occupational, accidental, death, and dismemberment coverage for members. So one of those two costs must be included in the budget. The second example here includes the correct FICA calculation. Additionally, the healthcare item was corrected to exclude the actual cost of the coverage, noting that it is provided off budget. And this example includes a line for the required member workers' compensation costs. This second example is far more compliant and it meets the requirements in the application instructions. Administrative and indirect costs are general or centralized costs that support the project. They do not include specific project costs. They may be included in an organization's indirect cost rate agreement if one exists. AmeriCorps state and national applicants who choose to include administrative costs in their budgets have three methods available for calculating them in Section 3 of the budget. Each method is thoroughly detailed in the application instructions. Using the corporation fixed percentage method, which is also referenced as the 5-10% fixed administrative cost option in the application instructions, applicants may charge administrative costs without a federally approved indirect cost rate and without documentation to support the allocations. Using this method, applicants can allocate 5% of the AmeriCorps share of direct costs to the AmeriCorps share of administrative costs and 10% of all direct costs, the total of both the AmeriCorps and grantee shares, to the grantee share of administrative costs. Applicants should follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. And if allocating less than the maximum allowed, please note the percentage claimed in the budget narrative. If applicants have a federally approved indirect cost rate, they must use this method, and the approved rate agreement constitutes documentation of the administrative costs. Again, the AmeriCorps share is limited to 5% of the AmeriCorps funds. Be sure to specify the cost type, that is, whether it's provisional or predetermined, fixed, or final, and supply the rate and the base on which it is calculated. It might be that it's salaries, or all salaries and fringe benefits, or modified total direct costs, or some other base. And then you will follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. Again, if allocating less than the maximum, we ask applicants to note the percentage claimed. Applicants must also enter the details of their approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in eGrants using the guidance that is included in the application instructions. The third calculation method, which is available to organizations who do not have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate and who receive less than $35 million in direct federal funding, is the de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs. It's important to note that if this option is elected, the organization must use it consistently across all the organization's federal awards. Regardless of the method used, the AmeriCorps share of administrative costs is always limited to 5% of the total AmeriCorps funds that are expended. Guidance for calculating these costs using each of the methods is in the application instructions. Please pay close attention to the calculation guidance to avoid having to correct your calculations during the resolution process. Now it's time to review some indirect cost line items. This first example shows a calculation using the corporation fixed or 5-10 percentage option. As demonstrated, the applicant is electing to claim the full 5% of the AmeriCorps share and less than the full 10% of the grantee share. This is allowable, and when done, applicants should state the rate they are claiming in the cost calculation as shown in this example. The second example shows an applicant with a federally approved indirect cost rate. As requested in the application instructions, they provided the cost type, the basis on which it was calculated, the approved rate, and the rate claimed, and they detailed the cost calculation. In this example, the rate is based on total salaries and fringe benefits. And while we didn't review these categories on the budget narrative, if you look at the sample budget that accompanies this training, you will see that these two budget categories total $93,529. The applicant multiplied that by the approved rate of 48.5% to get the maximum allowable indirect cost total of $45,362. In this example, however, the applicant is choosing to claim just 45% for a budgeted total of $42,088. As with the first example, the applicant is claiming the full 5% of the AmeriCorps share using the calculation provided in the application instructions. As a reminder, if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you must enter the details of that rate in eGrants using the guidance in the application instructions, and make sure to calculate the cost using the details of the rate. I want to note, if you applied for a federally negotiated indirect cost rate and it isn't yet approved, or you have an approved rate that recently expired or will soon expire, you should use the corporation fixed percentage to budget any indirect costs, knowing that you can revise your budget when you have an approved negotiated rate. The last section of the budget narrative is the source of funds section. In it, applicants won't list budget sections or line item costs. Rather, they will enter the source of those resources covering the specific line item expenses. Under the Budget Section 3 tab, applicants will find a link to enter source of matching funds, as shown here. Once they click that link, a new screen will open where applicants will enter the sources. Please be sure to include a brief description of the source of the match and whether the resource is secured or proposed, the amount of the match, the classification, that is whether it's cash or in kind, and the type of source, whether it's private, state or local funding, or federal funding in each of the appropriate fields. I caution you to update this section as well as the indirect cost section after making any budget revisions so that they reflect all changes. The total in this section must equal the total amount of budgeted match exactly. And as previously stated, while there is no cost share or matching requirement for fixed amount grants, AmeriCorps does not provide all the funds necessary to operate the program. Organizations should raise the additional revenue required to operate the program. To be complete and compliant, fixed amount applicants must identify the sources of the additional resources that will support the program in the source of funds section. When complete, the source of funds section might include content similar to this example. Note that this example only includes the source of the match, not the specific categories or line items covered by the matching resources. And it provides the required details, noting whether the resources are secured or proposed, in-kind or cash donations, and provided by a private or government entity. As you review this example, you'll see AmeriCorps cash match replacement entry that I mentioned earlier. When you request cash match replacement, you will enter the amount of that request as a source of matching funds, as shown here. Please be aware that when AmeriCorps issues a grant award with cash match replacement, the total of the match replacement funds will be added to the AmeriCorps share of grant funds, and together, the award amount may not exceed the maximum cost per MSY. In the examples from this presentation and in the sample budget narrative, the total AmeriCorps share of the award is $777,168. If we add the $70,062 of requested cash match replacement to that amount, the total funds awarded will be $847,230. And when we divide that by the 38 MSYs included in this budget, the actual cost per MSY is $22,296, which is below this year's maximum of $28,800. When completing this section, please take care as you use the drop-down menus. It's very easy to change the selected classification or source, and incorrectly entering this information may result in a request for clarification during the resolution process. As long as we're discussing matching resources, I do want to remind you again that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or your required match. Again, if you are not sure if a cost is allowable or not, the uniform guidance is the best place to find the answer. And as I previously noted, a sample budget narrative from which I pulled the examples in this presentation is posted to the funding page. So please feel free to use it as a resource when developing your own budget narrative. Before we close, I want to offer a few pointers, beginning with guidance to check and double check your work to eliminate erroneous information. And as previously noted, I want to stress the benefits of involving your team and someone outside of your team in the budget development and review process. And I strongly recommend using the tips on this visual and in the budget checklist found in attachment F of the application instructions to make certain you submit an accurate budget narrative that meets the AmeriCorps requirements. Highlights of the budget checklist include a check to make sure it meets the AmeriCorps cost guidelines. Is the full-time living allowance within the minimum and maximum levels between $17,600 and $35,200 per member, and all other member type living allowances are at or below the maximum? Is the cost per MSY less than or equal to the maximum allowed? As stated in the notice, the maximum for full-time members proposed in cost reimbursement applications is $28,800. The maximum cost per MSY varies for fixed amount applications and is detailed in the notice. While eGrants will calculate the cost per MSY for you, applicants can get a head start on determining the cost per MSY by dividing the total amount of AmeriCorps funds requested by the total number of MSYs requested. For example, if the application is for $100,000 in AmeriCorps funds and 10 MSYs, then the cost per MSY is $10,000. Note that the cost per MSY does not include childcare or the cost of Siegel education awards that members may earn, since those costs are excluded from the budget. And there is no maximum cost per MSY for planning grant applicants, since there are no related member costs in the budget. You will also want to check to make sure that the budget includes the minimum required match, and that the source of matching funds section is detailed and aligned with the amount of budgeted match. And if you are applying for a planning grant, please make sure that your request is at or below the maximum grant award of $240,000. As a reminder, operational grant award amounts will vary based on the scope of the proposed project. Applicants will also want to check that the budget includes all required costs, such as member gear, National Service criminal history checks, member FICA, and full-time member health care when required, along with those costs that AmeriCorps strongly encourages applicants to include, such as AmeriCorps technical assistance meetings and new staff attendance at the AmeriCorps Symposium pre-conference events. If you are not budgeting those costs, please include an explanation of how the costs will be covered in your budget. As much as possible, the budget narrative should provide details, including the purpose and accurate calculations in whole dollars, and exclude any unallowable costs. I recommend that applicants use $0 line items to enter additional clarifications if needed. And please remember to have someone check all of your calculations before you submit your application. And finally, and most importantly, applicants should ensure that they align the budget narrative to the program goals in the application narrative, including miscellaneous, contingency, or other undefined budget amounts may adversely impact your application status. In addition, before submitting your application, please make sure your organization has an active registration with the System for Award Management. all applicants must register with the System for Award Management at www.sam.gov and maintain an active sam.gov registration until the application process is complete. If an applicant is awarded a grant, it must maintain an active sam.gov registration throughout the life of the award. If you are applying to sam.gov for the first time, I recommend that you apply early as it may take a while to activate the registration. AmeriCorps recommends that you apply for or renew your registration at least 3 weeks prior to the application deadline to allow time to resolve any issues that may arise. Applicants must use their sam.gov registered legal name and address on all grant applications to AmeriCorps. Please know that sam.gov registration is a free service. Organizations should never pay for a sam.gov registration. If you are a new or recompeting applicant, please make sure to submit your Operational and Financial Management Survey, or OFMS, as instructed in the notice. You must also submit your most recent single audit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse and Form 990 to the Internal Revenue Service as appropriate. And please remember to enter your current federally negotiated indirect cost rate details in eGrants if you have one. These are a few of the resources the AmeriCorps team reviews as part of our pre-award risk assessment, which is referenced in the notice. For more information about the due diligence specific assessments, I encourage you to review the recorded due diligence review and compliance training that we've recently added to the technical assistance webinar sections of the AmeriCorps.gov Native Nations Funding Opportunity page. Finally, AmeriCorps is aware that on occasion, applicants experience challenges with the eGrant system. eGrants automatically performs a limited compliance check to validate the budget, and it may result in a warning or error message. Some of these messages prevent applicants from submitting the application, so you should be aware of the differences and the related actions. For example, when applicants receive a warning, they can move forward, but the application or budget may not be compliant with the guidelines. On the other hand, an error message will not allow applicants to move forward until they correct the error. Applicants must resolve all errors before they can submit the application. If you experience a challenge other than a warning or error message, you should contact the AmeriCorps hotline right away. The number is 800-942-2677, and a link to the help request form is at the bottom of most eGrants pages. It is wise to forward a copy of the service ticket to AmeriCorps grants at cns.gov so AmeriCorps has documentation of the problem. I want to draw your attention back to these bullets that I shared earlier. I encourage applicants to keep this checklist nearby as they develop their budget and frequently consult it as a budget development guide and quality assurance checklist. Many budgets require extensive revisions, in part because applicants do not follow the points outlined here. You will save yourself a great deal of follow-up effort by checking your proposed budget against this checklist before submitting it to AmeriCorps. As a reminder, AmeriCorps' Office of Grant Administration is hosting 2 live budget development office hour webinars in March. If you have additional questions about the budget-related details in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the application instructions, or in this webinar, I invite you to join me for either or both of these live question and answer webinars. The first is Wednesday, March 8th from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and the second office hour is Wednesday, March 19th from 2:30 to 3:30 Eastern Time. The links to register for these webinars are on this slide and on the fiscal year 2023 Native Nations funding page. I encourage you to keep a list of questions you ask during this recording and as you and your team work on your budget and bring those to the office hour calls. Additionally, you may submit your questions, whether related to the budget or other application features, to AmeriCorps grants at cns.gov. I hope you found this instruction a helpful guide for developing your Native Nations operational or planning grant budget and budget narrative. I encourage you to review the content from this presentation several times before submitting your application as part of your quality assurance process. I thank you for your time and for your interest in AmeriCorps and wish you all the best in this competition.